Hi, podcast listeners. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. We have so many guests on this show making a difference in our lives, making a difference all around the world with the expertise that they bring. And yet so many of you are reaching out to me saying, you want more. It's not enough just what we're putting on these podcast episodes for you. And so I am here to extend a very warm welcome to you to our Difference Maker community, where you can join for as little as $5 a month to get all this extra content. Out the gate, you're going to get 30 plus minisodes of exclusive content not available for the regular podcast listeners, and an exclusive minisode every month. And you'll get exclusive voting power to help us pick podcast topics and more. And that's at our Changers tier. There's 3 different main tiers and then an extra larger tier. But whatever tier that you join at, you will be included in this extra content. And I know that many of you are wanting to go a little bit deeper. And so even though it gets a little wild in there sometimes because of how deep we go, I want you to join us there. This extra content is very special. It means a great deal to me to be a part of this community with you. And I would love to just exchange ideas or perspectives that you have around these different episodes. And that's the place where we do it. So please show up to our Difference Maker community. Give us $5 out of your pocket every month. And I think that you'll have a lot of fun in there because we do. And I would love for you to join us. So go to patreon.com/A World of Difference to join us there. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm your hostess, Lori Adams Brown, and you are listening to episode 24. My guest on today's show is Kadi Cole. And no conversation about women in the church right now would be complete without having Kadi Cole speak into it. Kadi has spent the last 25 years serving in a local church ministry as an executive director of one of America's largest and fastest growing multi-site churches. She was also a director of a leadership network, a founding member of the Women's Executive Pastor Network. She has also authored, and this is how I discovered her several years ago, she authored a best-selling book called Developing Female Leaders. And if you have not read that, and especially if you've not heard of it, now you have, and you must get this book. It is an amazing book for everyone in the church to read. Super practical, full of research, and just very good insight based on all of her experience and interactions with many types of churches. You will find it very insightful. She also speaks at leadership conferences all around the world. Kadi has a master's degree in human resource development, which is certainly why she understands so much about this conversation, and is also passionate about helping local churches thrive. And she just really is. Kadi is helping move the needle forward on diversity and equipping faith-based leaders to fulfill their calling through her leadership consulting called Life Plans. And she has a coaching practice as well. You can check her out on her website at kadicole.com. It's Kadi. She has some really new stuff coming out that's very exciting. She has 2 new online courses, one for men, one for women. She has this masterclass that she's worked on, and she's writing new books for this year, for 2021. I also really encourage you to check out a blog that she wrote for Carrie Newhoff about supporting female leaders during the pandemic. It is excellent and just something we should all know about. That women face in a unique way during the pandemic and how we can support them in our churches. It is just my true honor to welcome Kadi Cole to the show. She has so many years of experience. She also worked as a nurse early on in her career, and she just has a true desire to help. But her desire to help is based out of an incredible amount of knowledge and experience that she brings from all her years of working in the church and also consulting with many pastors and church leaders around the United States. So welcome to the show, Kadi Cole. Hi, Kadi. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lori, so much. Thanks for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Oh, well, it's my honor. As soon as I heard about your book coming out, Developing Female Leaders, I just knew I wanted to be your friend. And the book was incredible. And I know you have another book coming out, but why don't you introduce yourself? I'd love for you to tell my listeners about your background and your family and kind of what you do.
Sure. Well, I'm Kadi Cole. I live in South Florida, but I grew up in the Pacific Northwest and moved down here because my first career was in nursing. And I came down to work at a hospital here, ended up working at a Christian university, and then eventually got recruited onto my church staff. We were a really fast growing church in the early 2000s. And I had a master's degree in human resource development by that time and a background in production and worship services. So they recruited me on to kind of help sort of bring some structure and planning and systems to this fast growing church. And I ended up staying on staff 17 years. And my last role was executive director over multi-site, where I oversaw our 9 campuses. When I came on staff, we were about 3,000. When I left, we were just about 23,000. So all that happens in between then, I've been a part of, and we mostly just tried to hang on, by the skin of our teeth and figure it out as we go. But it was a real blessing to be a part of. And a few years ago, I started my own leadership consulting company working with businesses and churches, and stumbled into this topic of developing female leaders, mostly trying to help churches reach their mission. And we discovered some critical people were missing. And so I wanted to take that on and try to help churches use all the leadership gifts that God has brought to their congregation.
I love it. You have so much experience. And I think especially when I think about your nursing background, my mom's a nurse. She ended up later on in toward the end of her career before she retired, she was the director of border health for the state of New Mexico. And even though she's retired, she's kind of not retired because she's, but I feel like the nursing profession in particular for women is such a great place for women leaders to be developed because it's like so many women in the industry. So I've seen that in you. And actually one of the ladies I currently mentor is a nurse and a strong leadership gift. I think it's really beautiful when those come together in the church. So,
It's so interesting. One of the pieces of my research is how the profession we grow up in shapes our view of leadership really over our whole life. And nursing is one of those wonderful professions. It is female dominated. So there are some barriers that I just didn't even get ingrained in my head in my early 20s that not everyone is that fortunate about. But there is something about nursing that is very holistic and supportive in its philosophy and function. And I have found, as someone who really ascribes to servant leadership and really biblically based leadership, that is a wonderful sort of underpinning for how we serve and how we look at the whole person and the whole system to make sure everyone can bring their best.
that's beautiful. I love it. And I mean, we have a nursing shortage here in California right now because of the pandemic. They're paying crazy amounts of money. It's, hats off to all the nurses out there who are listening. They're literally saving us during this time. I just think
Absolutely.
we don't give them enough credit, especially when I see our governor here in California is having to, change to where I think it's like normally you would have 2 ICU patients, but now you're having to have 3 because our ICUs are so full. And I just think, how are people mentally and emotionally and physically even coping with
Yep.
it? But it does make you strong for sure.
It's demanding. And,
Yeah.
when you demand something of yourself, you become bigger to reach it, hopefully. So, yes, as long
Yes.
as we don't break ourselves in the process.
Absolutely. That is so true. Well, I'd love for you to share a little bit about why you set out to write your book, Developing Female Leaders.
Well, at the time I was, to be really honest, I never thought I would champion this topic, which I know that, I am a leader, I am a female. It seems like this would naturally be something I would care a lot about. But to be really honest, it just wasn't necessarily a passion point for me. I know a lot of people, especially a lot of women who feel called to help women and help women leaders. That just was never my thing. I'm a local church girl. I've had an amazing experience growing up in a very small local church, about 150 people in the mountains of Montana. I saw community for what I think it's really supposed to be, and was a huge recipient of that. And I want that for as many other people as possible. I want them to hear about the Lord and then just be enveloped in a family of love and care and support and nurturing. And so that really has been my driving passion. And that's what took me into ministry. It's why I still love working with churches. But as I was trying to help churches create their multi-site strategies, work on their leadership development pipelines, which Those are kind of the two critical pieces on the executive and senior pastor level that you really want to get down well in order to be able to roll everything out and usually meet people's missions. What we started to find is that they simply just did not have enough leaders. They had a lot of resources, they had systems correct, they were feeling good about their, I wouldn't say discipleship is ever really figured out, but they were feeling good about everything they wanted to multiply, but they just simply didn't have enough leaders. And as we dug deeper into it, we found that they were missing a lot of women. Simultaneously, or actually, I should say, women were not growing through their pipelines that they had. Simultaneously, I was doing some conferences and mentoring groups with executive pastors and senior pastors. And I had a series of 3 executive and senior pastor teams come and talk to me and ask me if I could help them develop the female leaders on their team. They had these sort of up and coming strong female leaders. They wanted to leverage them. They wanted to maximize them. They wanted to develop them. And so they'd sit down over a lunch break and tell with me what they were doing. And for the most part, they were doing some really great things. There were a few things that kind of made me cringe for them that they simply weren't aware of. But at the same time, they were what I would call the good guys, like the good-hearted, godly pastors. They knew there was more in their church. One was from a very egalitarian, progressive church. One was from a very conservative complementarian. One was sort of in the middle. They were from different areas of the country because context plays into this a lot. And 3 very different sized churches with different ministry strategies. So they were all looking for the same kind of thing. And they were running into similar road bumps. And then as I would talk with the women on their team, unfortunately, most of them were not hearing in the same way these great pastors were speaking. What they were hearing was not what was intended in the messages. These women were oftentimes felt like they needed to look for another career. They felt like they had a lid on them. They were going to grow as far as they'd grown. If they wanted to continue to expand their leadership, they needed to go somewhere else. And so that chasm between what these great guy leaders were doing to develop female leaders and encourage and nurture them, and what female leaders were looking for and not getting, that space, I just felt like was such a shame to let go to waste. It was all this latent potential, dormant possibilities, and really between some simple miscommunications and misunderstandings, not even like they were on different pages, not even like they were coming at it from different theological views. They were mostly all together. They were just missing each other. And so that was really intriguing to me. So I mostly set out to do a research project to see if I could uncover how to help these few churches who were struggling with this. And in the process, ended up getting a great response to a survey I sent out on social media one day. We got 1,200 responses of female leaders who are working in churches. I did a series of interviews with high-level executive female leaders of churches and just found some unbelievable stories and trends and themes. And then I did a big research project into marketplace, academic, and ministry-based research, just to see what I could uncover. And out of that sort of birthed the book, these 8 best practices that either we as individual leaders or us as teams or even whole churches can do to really create cultures and environments where female leaders can bring their best gifts and really thrive. And also figure out who shouldn't be leading. Because to be honest, that's a part of the equation. This isn't an all or nothing idea. It's not like all women should lead, just like all men should not lead. But how do you find those women who are gifted by God and probably have not had great opportunities to grow and display their leadership? How do you find them? How do you develop them? And then how do you release them in the kingdom to really fulfill their calling in their own life and bring their best to your local church?
It's so great. It's just such a gift to the church, what you've written, what you've researched, and what you're getting out there. And I'm super excited to give you more of an audience with it today. And I hope everybody reads her book. I'll definitely put it in the show notes. One of the things you talk about in your book that I think is so interesting, and it's certainly been a part of my journey and the journey of many women that I talk to, and is often a surprise to many men. But I think it really might help explain some of the problems and the difficulties going on in the missing each other, which is this whole concept of the sticky floor that holds women back. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So we talk a lot about the opposite of that, which is the glass ceiling. In the church, we call it the stained glass ceiling, which
Right.
is sort of these organizational structures and systems that, keep women from advancing. But more important to that, especially in today's day, is this sticky floor, which are those internal dialogues and thoughts that women have about themselves that prevent them from going for leadership roles or taking advantage of doors that are open for them. And a very common scenario that I find is that a church will advertise a volunteer leadership role or even a job posting for a position in ministry, and sort of regardless of their theological background, which I should say, kind of here towards the top, what we found in our research is that this conversation really had much less to do with theology than we thought it would.
Yeah.
We found really egalitarian churches, very strongly egalitarian, have almost no women in leadership. And we found some very conservative complementarian churches who had women in all levels of leadership, including the executive suite. What it came down to was the culture. And so as we sort of dive into that, it's important to sort of keep that in mind, that we don't just rule women out because we're either for women or against women. In fact, that's not how either of those theologies actually work.
Right.
But most women have grown up with some mixed messages about their leadership, or perhaps she's a little bit older and grew up in an era where women were not allowed to speak up or speak out. They weren't involved in leadership, especially in formative years. And so we get these sticky floor syndromes as women, where we question whether we should really be there. We wonder, sometimes we wonder from an insecure place of if we're good enough, but more of it, especially with female leaders, is it's very logical. She looks around and says, there are no other women up there. Why
Right.
would they let me do that? It's sometimes not even a conscious decision. She's just like, that's not a place for me, or I wouldn't fit in there. Many times in leadership, we look for the person who's volunteering. We look for the person who's applying for a job, and we keep them in mind as we have a new job come up that they'd be a good fit for. Well, the sticky floor really holds women back from even applying for jobs. So one of the research pieces I talk about in the book is the 60-100 kind of syndrome, which is when men look at a job description, whether it's for a volunteer leadership role or maybe a new promotion at work, if they feel confident of about 60% of what's written on the job description, they will confidently apply. They figure they'll probably get the job. If they do, they will easily accept it. They're going to, they'll wing it. They'll Google it. They'll ask their dad. They'll fake it till they make it. They're going to figure it out. That's what we expect of most leaders in our cultures. For women, regardless of how talented they are, their education level, what their experiences are, when she looks at a job description, her initial reaction is very different. She needs to feel confident of 100% of everything on the job description from day one, or she won't usually even apply for the job. Think about that. She won't even apply. For those of us who are like, what? I always apply. You are one of the few minority women who just don't even second guess it. The majority of women, now they might eventually talk themselves into it, or they might run it by their husband or take it to their mastermind girlfriend luncheon and say, what do you think about this job? But her first reaction is, ooh, I don't know that I can do that job. And it really presents to us a lot of challenges because, first of all, as leaders, we can't see the people who are interested because they aren't even applying. Secondly, she tends to spend a lot of time and energy wondering, convincing herself, gearing up, when really all you have to do is be honest and apply for the job with your experiences, with your education, with the things you've done, and let the people decide whether or not you can do it. If you can't do the job, they'll let you know. But if you can do the job, they will also let you know that. And then many times women are offered the job and then they don't accept it because they are afraid of not nailing it, not crushing it, of taking too much on her plate, of what her kids are going to suffer, or is she going to be able to handle all the extra responsibility? Those are all parts of the sticky floor. And some of those are really real and valid, but none of them usually are barriers to advancing in leadership. There aren't many guys who decide not to take a job promotion because they may not be able to be home enough, or their kid in fourth grade might have an issue that they can't address. They take it and they figure out how to deal with the other things. They add to their plate. They don't give up because their plate is too full. And we can really do a lot of good for ourselves and for our sisters if we can encourage one another to think bigger, to think options, to look at how you could solve it rather than again, if you shouldn't take the job, please don't take it, but don't automatically disqualify yourself. At least have the conversations, at least run the options, at least investigate how you could make it work before you decide not to do it. Chances are 95% of the time, there's a better way to go about doing it than backing out. Usually there's a solution God has for you if he's calling you to it.
Yes, thank you so much for just explaining that. It's probably new for a lot of people, but even if you've heard it before, just being reminded of how much that does play into our minds. Like we think about tennis players, like Serena Williams will get out there, and we talk about the mental game is as important as the physical game, and how you see yourself is so formed of years of how you've been taught and socialized as to who you can be. And like you said, just that if you don't see your person on the staff that looks like you, that has your gender, or you walk into a staff meeting and you're the only woman every single time, there is sort of this imposter syndrome. You don't feel like you belong. Even if there's two women, you could still, two or even three, when it's a large room, there's just always that part that I think often, our brothers in Christ don't understand or experience until we enlighten them and let them know that that's kind of what we're dealing with. So a lot of people would look at even the church in certain churches, especially maybe egalitarian churches, as, this is a meritocracy. We have no lid on leadership for women in our church. So everybody's got the same equal opportunity. And yet those things going on with the sticky floor really are huge factors. And then you also mentioned, I found that very interesting, because I know here in the pandemic, we were reading a lot about women in the workforce, even in executive levels, who are stepping out of their careers because of online schooling. My kids have been in online school since March, all three of them. So it's going on a year now that we've been doing this. So I certainly understand that. I fortunately have a husband who's very hands-on at home, and it's helped me, or I would not be the woman leader that I am in the church today. That's been a huge factor for me. But in marriages where that doesn't happen or can't happen for whatever reason, I know that it is a possibility for some churches just to at least be aware and be more sensitive to the women on their staff that are dealing with a whole other full-time job at home of homeschooling and doing housework. And so I think just when we bring these things to light, when the truth is hidden in the dark, we just don't know. We make these assumptions like, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you able to do this job? Why are you quitting? Or why are you not applying? But when we bring the truth out there, like the sticky floor and things that women are dealing with, it helps all of us move forward and be more compassionate and sensitive to one another.
Absolutely. And I think men have a really important and critical role to help women really fulfill the calling that God has given them. And as pastors, that is really our job. Our job is to, shepherd the congregation and make sure that everyone is following the Lord as he's directing them individually and then corporately. And if we're not doing it on the individual level, especially with some of our leadership giftings, we're really missing out on being able to lead them corporately. And so, as you mentioned, sometimes the best thing and the most important thing is just to ask some good leadership questions of the women that you're leading. And I would say this is for guys, but this is also for women. I think that it was easy sometimes for me to just sort of, someone decided, oh, I've got this going on and I've decided to step down, or it's too much for me. And I'm like, okay, well, whatever. I respect that, instead of really stopping and saying, tell me more about that. Like, let's dive deeper. I want to get beyond your little, sort of cursory, things are busy at home, or I talked to my husband and he and I both agreed. Like, those are all the easy outs that women use to cover over their fears, to cover over their insecurities. Because really at the core of the sticky floor is fear. It's fear that I'm not going to do a good job. It's fear that I'm going to look like a fool. It's fear that I'm going to disappoint you as my leader. And most importantly, when we connect it to spiritual leadership roles, I'm fearful that I'm going to disappoint God. Well, fear is never the place that we can lead from. In fact, we can't even live and love from a place of fear, right? Because there is no fear in love, because fear involves punishment. So there is a concern that she will get punished somewhere, somehow, by someone if she doesn't perform at this level that she's holding herself to, which is not the level that you are holding her to. And it's not the level, certainly, that God is holding her to. So there is a theological issue, an understanding of God and his message of love and reconciliation that she is missing. That if you gloss over it and take the easy answer, and she's smart, she's a leader, she's going to tell you what will get you to back off, just don't fall for the first answer. Ask the deeper question, search through into her soul, and make sure what you're really discerning is God's direction, not her masking her fear of failure.
Oh, that's really good. I really like that. That's a very practical way that we can be pastoring people and really truly deeply listening instead of taking the surface level, which I think we all know in our nation right now and around our world, we could use a lot more deep listening in general. I want to unpack this one area that I think is really crucial. And you talk about this in your book, and it's something often people are completely unaware of. But it addresses the issue of the pipeline. And so, we love this man, Billy Graham. He just did so much for our nation and our world. I mean, I even have Singaporean friends that came to know Jesus over 40 years ago when he came once to Singapore. So incredible man. But he did have this rule that included a few different parts, and one particular part of his rule I think is really instrumental in this generation in particular of holding a lot of women back from being developed. And so I'd love for you to explain a little bit about what that rule looks like in a lot of the churches and why men and women should not be afraid to find another alternative that works better.
Sure. What you're referring to is what we call affectionately the Billy Graham rule. And he is, one of the spiritual fathers of our generation, hands down. And I would say, if you're familiar with the Billy Graham rule, I personally am a recipient of its benefits. And just to explain it a little bit, in case you don't know what we're talking about, it is really this kind of, I'm going to talk about the concept, and then I want to talk about his original intent with it. So the concept is that we want to protect our own sexual purity. We want to protect our marriages. We want to protect the reputation of our churches and our personal integrity. And we all know one of the biggest challenges to that is sexual temptation. We're seeing, pastors drop like flies continually because of this issue. And so there's the Billy Graham rule, also known as the Mike Pence rule, as Vice President Mike Pence has adopted this in his leadership, which is that I don't meet alone. As a man, I wouldn't meet alone with a woman, or as a woman, me, Katie, I wouldn't meet alone with a man, which makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. The unintended consequence of that is when you get into leadership levels, one-on-one conversations with people in power are how leadership works. If you're,
Right.
if you're in a team meeting and there's, 6 or 8 people around the table and you're figuring something out, that is an important part of leadership. But the other side of the coin is your one-on-one with your direct supervisor, or one-on-one with your peers at that table, figuring things out before you come to the leadership meeting. And if you can't have those one-on-one conversations, especially with leaders, people higher in the organization than you, it's really hard to advance in leadership, because the higher you go organizationally, the more leadership is nuanced, the more it's relational, the more it is built on trust. And if you are never able to have an individual conversation with someone, or ask a question, or have them inquire of you, it's really hard to accelerate and grow and have influence the way a guy would. Now, the Billy Graham rule was created in the 1940s when Billy Graham was a young kind of entrepreneurial evangelist making the rounds. And this was a time in the 1940s where evangelists were really sort of the new ministry buzz, that we've go through waves of it. So there were all these local churches that were smaller, and these evangelists would come and do tent meetings or big revivals at the city center or in a ballpark, and thousands of people would come to Christ and they'd go back to the churches. And it was a huge movement that's really spectacular. But as he was doing that, some of his peers who were also evangelists were getting photographed by the media, because as these tent meetings were happening, it was getting a lot of media attention, photographed, sleeping around and stealing money from the churches. Or they would take a love offering at these big rallies, and they would take the money and have huge cars and, stay in luxury hotels. And the media was also showing up, and they would find that there were pastor numbers. So like there was, 200 people, and the guy would say next week there were 1,000 people last week. So inflating all sorts of integrity violations. And so Billy Graham and his team decided, we want to be above board in everything, because the media is paying attention, and we don't want anything we do to get misconstrued and defame the name of Christ. So they had all sorts of standards. We only report exact numbers. We never take a love offering. We only tell people to connect back in their church. And they do all their fundraising before they come, so they're never tempted. And one of them was to make sure that we never ate alone or rode in a car with someone of the opposite sex, which only tells me they were doing this already. There were highfalutin women and strong leaders that they were meeting with, and they just said, we're going to always bring a third person with us so that it never looks like we're having an affair when we aren't near our spouses. Super wonderful, kept his ministry fully, full of integrity all through the years. The challenge that I have with the Billy Graham rule is not the heart behind it. First of all, I think we should incorporate a lot of things besides sexual purity to keep the integrity of our ministries going, because I see violations of integrity and trustworthiness happening in churches all the time. So we would do well to take a lesson from Billy Graham and actually just think about integrity and honesty and authenticity and transparency overall. But secondly, we don't live in the 1940s anymore. It's 80 years later. There were no telephones back then, except at the main desk of their hotel. They didn't even have phones in each room. There was no television. There was no internet. There were no text messages. There was no digital communication. None of those things existed. And so these rules that we've created for ourselves, where we're living in this Christian bubble, that as long as I only talk with one other woman and my senior pastor man only talks with another guy, somehow protects us, we are really fooling ourselves. The last two churches I've consulted through a moral failure, both of them happened and never technically violated the Billy Graham rule. Never ate alone in a restaurant together, never wrote in a card together. It was all done through made up emails and texting and sending bad pictures to each other and flirting over digital means. Like, all of these things happened and they never violated it. I would say to senior pastors out there that when you take that young student ministry intern to a conference with you and you share a room to save money and you eat every meal together and you're traveling, the two of you, that is no longer above reproach. We live in an LGBTQ world. That is no longer safe. And so these kind of gender-based isolationist ways of thinking about protection just simply aren't valid anymore. So if we need to blow that up, let's blow that up with intentionality and actually make it bigger. Let's have more limitations on our integrity and more boundaries and more checks and balances, but not do it at the cost of women or other minorities making it up into leadership roles. One of the recommendations I have is to, rather than use that kind of leadership tribe of always taking someone with you. So I'm sure you've heard it. It's, if you're going to go to a funeral, take someone with you so they can watch see and see how you deal with the family. If you're going to go to the emergency room because, some teenager is in trouble and the parents are in the waiting room, take someone with you and talk about it on the way there. Let them watch you minister. Let them lead in prayer. Debrief it on the way back. Always take two people with you. It's a simple little tweak. The principle stays the same, but instead of just one, take two. Take two men, take two women, take a guy and a girl, take someone who's 60, take someone who's 16, whatever you need to do. And I would challenge you to be more and more diverse and more inclusive. But if you take two people with you, you automatically dispel all of the intimacy, all of the one-on-one. Most of the situations that get us in trouble will be taken away by a third person present. Not all, but most will. And so if we can just think about it differently and challenge ourselves to expand our leadership strategies, expand our personal practices to be more inclusive, and at the same time, more protective, that is going to be the way we steward great leadership into the future.
Yeah, it's so good. I know there's a lot of people that are, currently trying to find better alternatives for this because of how many women are being left behind and not getting those like upper level conversations, like what you were saying. And this is a really practical thing. I think, especially on the person, the male pastor in particular, I think if we can put more of the burden on that male pastor to be the one to invite the other person, instead of saying to women, if you want time with me, you'll have to find another person yourself, because that also holds some women back if they're not as connected as that male pastor is. But the honest truth is, developing two leaders at once is way better than developing one at that moment. So wouldn't it? I mean, we're all about multiplication these days.
That's right. So it's very efficient. Yes,
right.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly one of the common struggles that we face. And yeah, I'd just be interested to know, what do you think are just the most common struggles of women leaders in all the churches you've observed? What would you say are kind of the top, 2 or 3 things?
For the women?
Yeah, for the women.
Or for the church. Okay, for the women. I think that sticky floor piece is a top one, because that has a lot to do with our thought life and how we view ourselves and our calling. I think second, feeling very lonely. There is a lot of weight that comes, especially if you're one of few women that are in leadership ranks. it does feel different. It isn't as fun. I mean, I've worked with huge teams of women, and I mean, let's be honest, it's way more fun than me being the only woman on a team. It isn't as jovial. You don't get your social needs met as much, so it is challenging. It is tiring. I think home life balance is another piece that is really unique to women, and the pandemic has only exacerbated that, but it has always been present. How to think about your life, how to think about your leadership. Again, especially if you're one of the minority leaders who are female, it's not easy to not have a lot of role models. There aren't a lot of people helping you. Your bosses probably aren't naturally also saying, hey, don't forget to put your time in for Christmas break, in July. No one's saying that to you because your kids are off. Versus me as a female leader, I'm selling that to my people all the time. Hey, school calendar came out. Everybody put your stuff in. Let's make sure everybody gets to be where they need to be at which violin concert and which soccer championship. Like, in August, we all start inputting our days off for the entire school year because that's how you get it done. Thinking through, there's a whole lot on that topic. I think also just the doors of opportunity, I think, are getting better, but there are many opportunities where women just simply get unintentionally overlooked. And I think especially in most church environments, not everyone, I would say in my experience and in talking to many women about this, I would say about 10% of the guys out there aren't the good guys. They really do have an issue with women. They might be feigning it or pretending or talking a good game, but in reality, we all know who those people are because we can feel it. And it's overt to us and covert to everyone else. And it can make you feel crazy. But for the most part, 80 to 90% of the guys out there are just unaware that the decisions they're making, the way they're processing, when they think of who they want to give an opportunity to, the reality is you are probably not at the top of their list. And so it takes extra energy to advocate for yourself and remind them every couple months, hey, just so you know, I really want to grow this year in these two topics. If you have any conferences, if you have any books, if there's anything you're doing, just reminding them, because when they get an email from some rich guy in the church that says, hey, I've got 3 open seats on my private jet to a thing up in New York. Do you want to go and bring some of your staff? Chances are you're not falling on the front of that list for those 3 open spots unless you're advocating for yourself consistently and reminding them, because their brain just isn't going to go there. And so those are the pieces that I think most men would be surprised to know we're actually hoofing it on all of those and making up our own rules and trying to figure it out. It takes a lot of energy to innovate. We're innovating almost every aspect of our life. The actual job is the easiest part of our world, right? The thing you put on the job description that I was intimidated about, that I can do with my eyes closed. It's all the other stuff that requires my full attention, a lot of prayer, a real contrite and confident spirit, really being sensitive to the Holy Spirit on where he's moving and where he's not, when to speak up, when to not, how to champion myself without being annoying. There's so many rock and hard places when you're one of the first, but I'm just telling you, it's worth it. And I want to encourage all the women out there who are like, it is so hard. Everything she's saying is me. You're not alone in it. This is the time of transition. We are the women who will do it. And I'm not so big on myself to think I'm like making way for tons of women to come after me. I'm just saying, if we just keep showing up, God's going to open up doors and allow everyone to have more access. And it's not just about us. This is not just so that we have, more women in leadership. We're the majority of the church, and we're the minority in leadership. If we can't find the confidence, if we can't articulate our needs, if we can't advocate ourselves, how's my Black brother down the road who's less resourced at a church with lower socioeconomic level, how's he ever going to connect with our pastoral team if we haven't done the hard work of making inroads to create diversity at the highest levels? How are our African-American sisters or other people of color in our church who are actual minorities going to break into leadership if we, who are the majority, can't find our way to stand up for ourselves and each other? That's who we're opening doors for, because God doesn't say, that it's going to be every gender is going to be represented. He says every tribe, tongue, and nation. That's who we're fighting for, is actually inclusion of the whole body.
I love that. Yes. And it actually leads so well into my next question, because I have a lot of people who have this I hear this a lot. This issue of women and diversity of leaders in the church is a secondary issue that really should only be talked about when everything else feels like we're doing well there. And then if there's extra time, then we might talk about, how to increase diversity, whether it's, women or people of different racial backgrounds. But yeah, what is your perspective on that? When you're painting a picture of the gospel, when you're painting a picture of like what heaven is going to be like, and how integral diversity is in that picture in the kingdom. What is your perspective on this being a secondary issue to include women as leaders in the church?
Well, I think I would just not think about it that way. I'm an organizational strategist. That's part of my expertise. And so when I think of what we're doing for the kingdom, I want to know what God has asked you to do with your church, with your business, with your life, with your family. And if we know what you're going after, then we know who we need at the table, which by the way is all the gifts. To me, it's more important that we have a diversity of gifts and all the gifts in the right place than it is that we have a certain percentage of men and women, because God's in charge of the percentage. I don't get to decide who gets a leadership gift. I do get to decide how I steward all the leadership gifts in the church where I serve. And if we could just get the main thing, which is fulfilling our calling and using the resources that God has given us, He's got the diversity figured out. Now, the diversity thing to me is up to Him. I'm just in charge of getting leadership at the table. And so in my experience, we tend to leave off about 60% of the leadership gifts in our church by not including women and minorities as easily as we include white men, especially white middle-aged men. And to be really honest, one of the things that I mean, this is a little blunt, but I believe one of the biggest challenges to the church right now is that we have white men in leadership who do not belong in leadership. They don't have leadership gifts. They don't have pastoral gifts. They do not have a calling. They've not been educated. Their calling has not been confirmed. And we have put them in positions of leadership, which not only frustrates the church and has got to be disheartening to Him, but it blocks the person who's supposed to be in there from having that role. It's like a triple lose. And I'm just saying, gosh, let's relook at how we're looking at this. Get your eye off the agendas and your eye onto who's God given you and how do you release them. This is Ephesians 4, equipping the saints for service. If you're equipping people in areas they're not gifted, nor called, nor confirmed, you got to call into question how you're leading your church. That's kind of the basic of what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, that's definitely, I've seen that quite a bit as well, because, there's just this assumption, and this is our society. What we're talking about here is the culture that we live in the United States of America, where white males are center in so much of what we perceive as being a leader. When we picture leader, and when we picture pastor or even priest, and in certain churches, a lot of people will picture a white male, middle-aged, individual. And so when that's our automatic, then they do get put into those positions because that feels like that's what it's supposed to look like. So I love how you're trying to get us to break down those stereotypes and really think about gifting and starting with that, because that's certainly what we're reading in scripture. So I know you mentioned the good guys a lot, and I certainly am blessed to know many and be married to one and work with many. So I'd love for you to address just a few issues related to that. So somebody like you who gets to interact with a lot of the good guys, what do you think are some of the most important steps that these good guys could take this year to help develop the female leaders around them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say there are many middle-aged white guys gifted and called to leadership. So just to articulate that.
Of course.
These are the ones. Yes. Okay, good. So a few things that if you are in a position of authority, then I think there's a few things that you can really do that will make a big difference, because your voice does go louder and further than anyone else's voice. And so I can say something 20 times, you can say it one time and still probably get more buy-in. So you saying it matters a lot. So the first is to be really clear about your theology. And this is kind of what you were alluding to about this being a secondary issue. Theologically, this has to be a primary issue, that we see God in everyone equally, that there is no superior race, gender, age, look, talent, giftedness, that we are all equal. And when we talk about the theology too, then articulating how that plays out in our culture around gender, around race, around age, all the areas that we could discriminate. We have to sort of re-rally people because our culture is pulling us towards discrimination. It's pulling us towards segregation. It's pulling us towards assumptions and stereotypes. It's our job to push up the hill of the truth of the gospel. It's our job to push up the hill biblical truth. And it's your job as a good guy leader to take God's word and teach it to the people and articulate, this is what we believe, and this is why we believe it, and this is how we expect it to be lived out here. Part of the challenge is that many churches on the very top level, senior pastor, executive pastor, are really clear around their theology of women, and they know where women are invited to lead. As you go further away from the senior pastor's office, that gets cloudy and muddy, and many men have wrong assumptions about what their senior pastor believes, and they're carrying out a culture that I can almost guarantee you their senior pastor would cringe knowing those things were happening to women in his church. So it's really important that you take a stand and be clear and articulate from God's word. Now, it's a gray issue and it's theologically debatable because there are many different views on it and they're all biblically based. My thing is you don't have to change your theology to stand up for women. You do have to stand up for your theology in order to champion for women. And so take a stand, articulate it, and then build the culture you want. We mentioned the sticky floor earlier. It's important for male leaders to reach beyond the sticky floor and have those conversations and ask those questions and recruit women into leadership differently, at least until you start getting the pipeline going and women start realizing that your culture is open to who they are and that you want them on the team. And then that last piece that I mentioned earlier, always taking two, kind of changing your own personal habits, challenging yourself to think differently. If you go out to lunch with every guy on your team and the one girl on your team you have in the office for a 60-minute meeting with lots of paperwork, you are not leading consistently across the board. If you can't take everybody out to lunch, don't take anybody out to lunch. Lead consistently. Let everybody know they get to have access to you in equal ways. So there are many amazing women on your team. There are many gifted leaders of all shapes and sizes in your congregation. It's our job as church leaders to find them, equip them, encourage them, and release them into ministry and help them grow into everything God has called them to be.
Yeah, that's really good advice and very practical steps that people can take this year as they're trying to go deeper in this area. We talked a little bit before about how, some men just have this picture that this, church staff and the access to leadership on it is, this meritocracy. And sometimes they're surprised to know that there are any microaggressions or anything like that a woman might face because they're not hearing them. They're not feeling the sticky floor. They're not noticing that, the room is like, 19 men and one or two women. Like it's not even on their radar. It's not, some way that they see the world. It's not their lens. So what do you think is something that even the good guys often miss in this conversation?
I think one of the biggest things is just being open to the experience of minorities on their team in general. Thinking through things that you wouldn't, it really takes a critical eye. It takes a energy and it takes some intentionality to pay attention to how people are experiencing your leadership. And so some of those things you mentioned, like microaggressions, which is really like those sort of small slights that really normally wouldn't, bother you, or they're kind of actually a normal part of leadership. We all have people who rub us wrong. No one's going to like everything I say. In fact, most people are going to not like a lot of things I say, but it's kind of having a thick skin is a part of being a leader. Yeah. The challenge for women or even other minorities is that the consistency of them and the frequency of them are about 100 times what they are for a typical guy. And so those start to weigh down on you over a while. In fact, part of my research showed that the confidence level of a female leader was directly related to how long she was on a church staff. So the longer she was on a church staff, the less confident she became over time. That is the exact opposite of what happens to men. For men, the longer they're on their church staff, the more confident they feel, the more relationships they have, the more friends they have, the more affirmation they get. For women, the exact opposite happens. They lose friendships. they lose affirmation, they lose confidence, they lose credibility because they're spending their leadership capital in ways that our cultures often don't like what female leadership looks like or interacts, or they're just resistant to hearing those things or getting those decisions from a woman. And so part of it is you have to pay really extra attention to the women who are crushing it and not assume, oh, good, we finally found one who can handle it. That's not what's happening. She's just the one who's able to be in it for now. But if you don't steward her leadership as well as invite her leadership in, you're going to continue to have a turnover, which many churches have experienced this with racial challenges when they're trying to create racial diversity on their staff. Is they're like, we can't, it's hard to find them, and then it's hard to keep them. Well, the same thing happens with women. That's not the fault of the people you're recruiting. That's a sign that your culture is sicker than you realize, and you need to fix the culture so that the people you invite can thrive and actually get the benefits that you currently get of the culture. They're living in a different space than you are. You need to make sure that everyone's receiving the same wonderful experience you are receiving.
Yeah, I think that culture piece is so huge because, as someone who's been in many cultures and speaks many languages and loves cultures, we don't all experience culture in the same way. Obviously, gender plays a huge factor. I have skin that would be described as white. So even as I learned Indonesian and lived there for 10 years and experienced the culture and lived and dressed like everybody else, my experience in the culture was very different because of how I looked and how I was treated. And there was even a white privilege within that, situation. But I think culture is so huge. We're not all experiencing the church culture, even on a church staff, in the same way as every other person is. And it's important just to be aware of that the experience can be different. And I know, I remember in the very beginning of your Developing Female Leaders book, you have this little story about how you were first out of college and you encounter this guy, and he talks about like your birthing hips, which is so bizarre to even say and super weird, right? But it's like those little things can just, chip away at your confidence, almost like, death by 1,000 paper cuts, which, like, if you don't know that a person's experiencing that, and if you only had that one moment, it would be fine. But if you went through like a month and you had 100 comments like that, like
Which would not be unusual, by the way.
Yeah.
That would not be unusual. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
talk
And I
about what
think
you see there.
if you think about that, it takes 8 positive comments to undo the effects of 1 negative comment. That means if let's just say a typical woman hears about 100 negative comments or slights in a month, that would mean as your leader, part of your responsibility is helping her have 800 positive experiences, positive comments, positive attagirls. And so, there's all sorts of things that keep that from happening. We tend to not give women the same amount of feedback. We tend to feel awkward saying good job or giving her a high five, which are those small little positive affirmations. And so it challenges us to rethink our own individual leadership practices. That's what's going to change. This is not, there are systematic issues. There are all sorts of issues that are more global, but at the end of the day, if each of us as leaders begin leading in more loving and inclusive ways, everything shifts almost instantly.
That's so good. That's just very practical advice. Like, even if you're looking at your staff at your church, like realizing the women are going to need that much more, if we're going to level the playing field for them, because,
right. And it's not because they're fragile.
No,
it's
no,
not because they're fragile.
Yes.
It's because your culture is beating them up. And if you had another guy that was getting beaten up, extra TLC for him too. So that's what you've got.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, I'd love for you just to hear at the end, just like give us a little message for both men and women in the church, things that you would most like each of them to know, address what would be at stake in 2021 if we just literally did nothing about this issue. And I'd love for you just to even paint us a picture of what you imagine a future to be like if we get this right.
Well, when I talk about this subject, I always come back to John 17, where I feel like Jesus is the one who paints us the picture, right? He paints the vision of what he's praying for in his last days here on earth. He's praying that we would be one, the disciples yet to come, right? That's us. We're the disciples that were yet to come. He wants us to be one as he and the Father are one. He doesn't look down or into the future and say, gosh, I hope there's a bunch of segregation. I hope that the Black church stands up and the white church finally listens. He just sees his church, his body. And as leaders, we know that. We know that the future is not male, but we also know the future is not female. The future is not just Black or white or some other kind of combination. It's not young or old or just middle-aged. It's not rich or poor. It's It's all of us. It's all of us connected to God, connected to one another, and moving forward in the ways the Holy Spirit is leading us. And when I look at 2021, there's no other answer for the church than to be in lockstep with the Spirit and to be the body He has called us to be. My personal opinion, I think 2020 has been a like a rumbling, a shakeup of many things, in particular the church. I think we've been a little addicted to ourselves too much. We've been not willing to listen to the promptings that God has been giving us for change and for adaptation, and to become more aligned with His message and His vision of who we are. And we now have a choice. We can either try to go back to what was. Man, I hope things get back to normal. I wish our people would come back. Like, we can try to go backwards, but backwards wasn't working. I don't know if anyone was watching all the statistics I was. Why would we want to go backwards? That was not working either. So let's move forward into what God is really calling us. I think He's going to call up the remnant. I think the remnant is going to have much more diversity than we've ever seen before. I think I want to be a part of it. And I'm hoping all of your listeners want to be a part of it too. So we have to shed our own biases, shed our own practices, even shed the things we were taught and have held on to up until this point, so we can be open to the ways and the workings of what the Holy Spirit wants to do in a new day and in a new dawn, for a new church to stand up and take its place in the world.
I love it. That's an incredible vision. That makes me very hopeful about 2021. We needed that hope today, didn't we? Well, tell us about like your new book coming out, where they can find it, where they can find you, and all the resources people need to know.
Sure. Well, thank you. Well, so my book, Developing Female Leaders, is on Amazon and Audible. If you'd like to do that, I do have a new book I'm writing. It's a devotional on 100 days to find your leadership voice. So that's going to be coming out in the next few weeks. You can go to my website, kadicole.com. I have all sorts of free resources there. You can sign up for our email newsletter, which I don't send out very often, but I do try to keep people up to date on products we have or things we're doing, or podcasts like this, if you want to kind of stay in the loop on that. And then I do have some courses available. So if you are a church leader and you want to help your team or your church sort of process through the 8 best practices, there's a video on there that you can use in your staff meetings. Or if you are a female leader, there is a video series on where I take everything from the book, which was really written for guys, but I take all the research and all the points of the book and sort of rework it to a female leader's perspective. We have a lot of people doing it as a small group curriculum, and have been having a lot of really great discussions, and a really great way to challenge yourselves and each other in how to step into this next year in a more productive and more healthy way of leading.
Well, thank you so much, Kadi Cole. You are amazing. We are honored that you're with us today. You are just a huge blessing to the church here in the United States and around the world with this message that you're bringing to us. I just pray the richest blessings on you and a fruitful ministry.
Well, thank you, Lori, so much. And I really appreciate all you're doing in the kingdom as well.
All right. Bye, Kadi. Have a good day. Wow. Well, I was so encouraged by that. Encouraged to know that there are women like Kadi out there leading the way in this and doing the really hard work of doing the research, writing the books, coaching and consulting, and just leading. She really is incredible. And when she talks about how she really didn't want to get into this, I find it remarkable because she's doing just an outstanding job. And we owe her such a great debt, don't we, for all this work and all that she continues to do. Her book, if you've not checked it out before, Developing Female Leaders, highly recommend it. It's excellent in every way. The research in it is very clear, and she can help you walk through whether you're more of a complementarian church or an egalitarian church or whatever along that spectrum, help you, make sure that women can be at whatever level of leadership that you believe theologically is appropriate. And as she said, it's less about theology and more about just the practical nature of walking alongside women and developing these leaders in the church through, elements like the sticky floor and some of the microaggressions they face, and just having those conversations, opening eyes and being aware and doing some deep listening. And without those conversations, it's really hard for women to move forward because of all the things, that she was talking about today. But she's here to help, and she's trained many others to help. So she can come to your church and consult with you. Check out her website, kadicole.com, and you'll find many resources there, such as her masterclass for church leaders, her masterclass for female leaders. And she's working on another book, as she mentioned, So yeah, I totally encourage you to check that out, as well as the blog that we mentioned that she wrote for Carrie Newhoff about what healthy churches are doing to support female leaders during the pandemic, which has thrown a wrench into women in the church and women in just, every workforce at this point, even at the executive levels of companies where it's tough for women to do all the things. And so as leaders in the church, we can support them to help make sure that they stick around and we continue to develop them because we see them and we see the potential. So, yes, thank you, Kadi, so much for this gift today. We are just honored to have you to help stir up these conversations, to help us think more deeply, to do better, because you're helping us pave the way for a future being together with men and women. And just so grateful. For all of the A World of Difference podcast listeners, Kadi Cole has agreed to give us a discount on her Female Leaders Accelerator, which is an 8-week on-demand video experience talking through the content and research from the Developing Female Leaders book, which is a best-selling book from a female leader's perspective. It includes also an individual coaching call with a female executive pastor. So all of you A World of Difference podcast listeners are going to get 10% off with the code WOD10. That stands for World of Difference 10. So if you go to kadicole.com, or if you want to go directly to kadiscourses.teachable.com, and it's spelled Kadi, and her last name is Cole. So kadicole.com or kadiscourses.teachable.com, and you can click on the Female Leaders Accelerator. You can type in the code WOD10 and get 10% off of this amazing course, this amazing resource today. Next week on the World of Difference podcast, in our Women in the Church series, we are going to have a guest who is an expert in the area of sexuality around women in the church. Sheila Gregoire is a popular speaker, author of 9 books, marriage blogger. She has written a book called The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, and her latest book coming out in March is called The Great Sex Rescue. She's going to come encourage us in this area in a way where we can sort of dig into some of the lies that have been told from the culture and from within the church also, unfortunately. So please tune in for that. She's amazing. She takes an uncomfortable conversation and makes it very practical and helps us dig deep in ways that we really should in this conversation to just find the freedom that God wants us to have and to not live in some of the lies and the muck and the yucky stuff out there that is just not okay for us. So let your sisters know, let your friends know to come and listen to this podcast, because I think it's a really, really important one. In the meantime, everybody stay healthy, stay safe, and if there are women around you that work in the church, especially during this time, reach out to them and just encourage them. After what Kadi told us today, if you have 100 microaggressions, you really need like 800 encouragements, and no one person could do all that. So we need each other. So go encourage somebody that you know that's a woman that works in the church today. And have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye. As we're finishing this episode, if you're thinking, I really wish I could learn more or go a little bit deeper, well, that's what our Difference Maker community is for. I would love to welcome you in to join the rest of us there. Once again, it's only $5 a month to join, the price of a latte at your local coffee shop. You can join at our Changers tier. Difference Makers is a community that really means so much to me. It's very special because each time I have a guest on the show, I record something outside of what we give to just the regular podcast audience, where we go a little bit deeper, and then I post those video episodes in this community and we can discuss them. But also at the very beginning tier, which is our Changers tier of this community, you'll get exclusive voting power and help pick podcast topics that give us, more of what we want from your perspective. You'll have access to exclusive 30 plus mini-sodes that aren't out there for the general public. And you'll get every month an exclusive monthly bonus mini-sode. At our Groundbreakers level, which is $10 a month, you can join and get all of that, but also priority access to submit questions to the podcast. And you'll get an additional 2 exclusive monthly bonus mini-sodes. And at our Trailblazers tier, which is $15 a month, the price of 3 lattes a month, you can get all of that, plus also 3 exclusive monthly bonus minisodes, and a patron shout out. So I would love for you to join us at any of those tiers. It'll help you come into this community, be in the midst of all of us, other difference makers, and we'd love to hear your perspective. I certainly would. It's a place to engage more with me and the audience around what you like, what you're resonating with, and once again, go deeper with each of our guests. So please join us in this membership community. I would love to hear your perspective and love to share this extra content with you. So show up at patreon.com/a world of difference.